Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Peoria Riverfront Museum's viewing room on New Philadelphia, how a Black man freed his family and founded an abolitionist village in central Illinois. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I am Lottie Fittis, Curator of History here at Peoria Riverfront Museum. Tonight, I am honored to be joined by Gerald McWorter and Kate Williams McWorter. Tonight's program will be recorded and available to view again on the museum's YouTube page. And here at the Peoria Riverfront Museum, we are currently hosting an in-house curated exhibition called Community, African American Freedom, Perseverance, and Leadership During Migration. As part of this exhibition, we have been honored to work with the McWorter family and the New Philadelphia Association and feature New Philadelphia and Frank McWorter in this exhibition. New Philadelphia is located in Pike County, Illinois. It was the first town in the United States founded and registered by a Black man in 1836. It was an abolitionist village, and it was just 20 miles from the slave markets of Hannibal, Missouri. Tonight, our wonderful guests will discuss how this happened, how it's being remembered, and what it says about our future. They'll also go into a little bit more about the McWorter family, which I can tell you after putting this exhibition together, they are a really inspiring family. So I'm excited to learn more myself this evening. A little bit more about our guest tonight. Gerald McWorter is the great-great-grandson of Frank McWorter. He is a professor emeritus at the University of Illinois. He has researched and taught and lectured about African American history and culture around the world, only to find him writing about his family late in life. A lifetime scholar, activist, raised in Chicago, he earned his PhD from the University of Chicago and just finished 2 books on the history and future of Black studies. Kate Williams McWorter is an associate professor at the University of Illinois who educates future librarians. She was glad to learn that the McWorter women live long lives and also to discover her own family history in Texas. Not only includes Confederate soldiers, but also one who helped stop a 1860 lynching. If you have not had a chance to read their phenomenal book titled New Philadelphia, you are able to purchase a copy in our museum store. Feel free to ask questions throughout the talk tonight via the comment section on Facebook. We will address questions at the end. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Kate and Gerald to present tonight's program. Thank you so much, Kate and Gerald.
Thank you so very much. We certainly would like to express our appreciation to the Peoria Riverfront Museum for inviting us to come, not only to participate in the exhibit, but to make this presentation. So thank you very much. What we're going to do is to talk about New Philadelphia. We're going to tell a story. And really that's what history is, the telling of stories. We want to share our method with you. And it's something that we did. But it's something we're inviting you to do as well, because history has to be told by all of us, academics who make a living in the profession of history, as well as people in communities who have memories and who tell the story of their community. There are 3 aspects of our methodology. First, we gather all the documents, all the evidence we can, which really comes down to paper, and photographs, as well as the artifacts that archaeologists might dig up from sites that reveal the past history. But these are individual pieces of information, and they have to be woven together into a story. And so we also have, secondly, oral history. This is the intentionality of the transgenerational process of memory. And then the final aspect is historical imagination. We have to connect all these dots, all these pieces of evidence, and then we have to begin to ask questions. And it's these questions that guide us to search for more evidence in the telling of our stories. And so as we tell the story of New Philadelphia, we really want you to think about not only our story, but think about your own story. Think about Peoria, or if you're listening from other places, wherever you're from, because there's a story to be told there, not only based on the facts and based on the oral histories that we can uncover, but thinking about connecting all of that information into a story. So we invite you to enjoy our story about New Philadelphia.
So in getting ready to come to Peoria virtually, we started thinking and wondering about Peoria, and of the most interest to us was to find out what was African American Peoria and abolitionist Peoria at the same time as New Philadelphia. And the most wonderful things popped up at us in no time: the power of the internet and the power of all the work that's been done in Peoria on its own history. So Peoria's Main Street Presbyterian Church, as some of you in the audience may know, was really considered an abolitionist church, and among its leaders were the Pettengills, Lucy and Moses Pettengill, and Lincoln himself was considered Pettengill's intimate friend. And the church was famous for, and the Pettengills in their house were famous for helping move freedom seekers along. And Preston Jackson, most recently, the 20th and 21st century sculptor in Peoria, sculpted this, told this story, and that's the Pettengills looking at two freedom seekers in a boat. And what's really poignant and remarkable about the Presbyterian Church today, it's a different name and it's merged with another Presbyterian church, but the bell that rings in that church is the same bell that was rung every time the Union Army won a battle in the Civil War. So if you hear that bell in Peoria, it'll take you back to the 19th century. The next thing was to go a little deeper. We have been hugely impressed by the coloredconventions.org website, which collects the documents and more about the colored conventions that happened across the country. And just the two in Illinois, and we'll talk more about these conventions later, two in Illinois were attended by people from Peoria County. And these are just the two before the Civil War. And you see that W.L. Barnes and Thomas Mason attended both of them. So we don't know whether you all have already dug up all the information on these three people or whether these are questions to be answered. But it's really very exciting, and it's very central to the New Philadelphia approach to things, to look at the abolitionists, but also to dig into the Black community, because the Black abolitionism was less visible than white abolitionism, and we're always looking for Black agency, which is what New Philadelphia represents. So way to go, Peoria.
As you will discover, we're going to be presenting this as sort of a tag team. So you're going to hear from Kate, you're going to hear from me. So looking at these maps, we take us really back to the 1830s. And Frank was able to establish the town, plat the town as the first town platted and registered by an African-American in the United States. You see that on the right of the slide, New Philadelphia. But on the left, what you see is Pike County at the time was really quite a large part of Illinois. It went not only from where Pike is, you see the arrow there with the kind of the anvil shape of Pike County, all the way up to Chicago and the Wisconsin border. So that was Pike County. But right in the middle, you see the identity of New Philadelphia, which was in Hadley Township as part of Pike County. These maps are very important because if you look very closely at this map, you'll see the names of the landowners, and you can see not only the Mcwhorters adjacent to New Philadelphia, but in other parts as well. So these maps are really quite important. Now, one of the important aspects of telling the historical story of the United States that must always be reintroduced, I say reintroduced because it's so often left out, is the experience of the indigenous people who were here prior to the European colonization, or some would even say invasion of their territory. And one of the important ways in which the indigenous population really connected to this area near New Philadelphia was the infamous Potawatomi Trail of Death, where these people from Indiana through Kansas were put into a forced march through inclement weather. And if you look closely, you'll see that they went through Springfield and eventually through Quincy, and they actually went less than 15 miles north of New Philadelphia. And so we very much identify the struggle against slavery with the oppression that the indigenous population experienced. And of course, the agency of these indigenous people is very important, and therefore we include the picture of Chief Black Hawk, who was an important leader and whose words have actually been preserved in questioning the morality of people that invaded their land and oppressed their people the way they did. Now, of course, in this part of the country, again, as part of the background to New Philadelphia, we have to talk about the two important men who were often the main figures in the discussion of the moral and political struggle against slavery. Abraham Lincoln, connected really to the east of New Philadelphia in Springfield and many other places. And then on the west, just across the Mississippi River in Hannibal, Missouri, we have Sam Clemens, known to us most favorably as Mark Twain, the author. Both of these men are often referred to as part of the anti-slavery sentiment. But it's important to really understand the complexity of the American experience. So, for example, Lerone Bennett's book on Lincoln, Forced into Glory, really talks about Lincoln as someone who was trying to preserve the Union and had his own prejudicial feelings early on with regard to African Americans. And so Forced into Glory really is the story of how Lincoln first was interested in perhaps having African Americans sent back to Africa, eventually took the position against joining the abolitionists against slavery and embracing the struggle of African Americans for their own freedom. And to the right, you see the book Searching for Jim, written by Terrell Dempsey, a lawyer from Hannibal, now living in Quincy, Illinois. Interesting that Hannibal was a slave market, Quincy was the abolitionist town. And so this book about Mark Twain really is a story that corrects Mark Twain's self-portrait of not having learned about slavery from his family. Well, this book demonstrates that his family, in fact, were slave owners, and that's how Mark Twain learned about it. So here you have the story of two important men as part of the anti-slavery struggle, but at the same time, you see the contradictions in their own lives. And it's very important for us to face up to these contradictions of American history.
So just to extend the context a little bit and talk more about this important convention movement. So there was a national movement of Black people to convene and discuss what they needed. And this map here shows the origin counties of the people who participated in the two conventions that took place in Chicago and Alton. And it's remarkable that people came from all over the state to both conferences, and that Peoria County is one of the few places that sent people to both of the conferences, the purple and the red. And what's interesting is to read too the demands of the conference. This is the demand of the Alton Conference. First, we complain of being taxed without the right to vote. Second, we are denied the right to testify against a white man. In other words, they didn't have any legal right. And third, we pay school taxes without the privilege of sending our children to public schools. So taxation, the right to equal rights, and schools were the three concerns of the people who gathered at Alton. And this movement is very rich, and the identities of the people that came to the movement are doorways through which we can go into communities and understand what was happening in those communities at the time of those conventions, and plus or minus a few decades. Now, in addition to the talking about the issues of freedom, there was also something that is called practical abolitionism, and those were the people who put their own safety on the line to help freedom seekers move north through an almost infinite number of paths to the north, some of which even went south, because some people had to go south in order to get north. And as we've learned more and more about the landscape and spoken at different places around Illinois, we invariably have to add that city to the map. So we just added Peoria to the map because, of course, we hadn't looked closely at Peoria until now. And it's so important to see this, that all our different local histories are linked in this way. They're linked by common cause, but they may even be linked by the fact that the Mcwhorters might have known people in any of these locations. New Philadelphians might have traveled to these other locations. These other places might have sent people to New Philadelphia. So on the left here, just showing two very important Illinois dramas, the story of Elijah Lovejoy, whose press was thrown into the water and who was into the river and who was killed. And then Dr. Eales in Quincy, whose case of helping a freedom seeker by the name of Charlie went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it became a national cause célèbre that helped raise consciousness of the whole country around freedom. And so there are these local stories that really are of national importance, even though the nation may not know about them yet.
So now we get to the story of New Philadelphia. And it's important to say that while we're talking about the Mcwhorters, we're really talking about a town with many other people and many other families, and each of these families has a story to tell. That's why we called our book New Philadelphia. It's the beginning of telling the full story of the town. And so here we see the couple, the husband and wife, who really founded the town, Free Frank McWorter, Free Lucy McWorter. They were called Free Lucy and Free Frank while being slaves in adjacent plantations in Kentucky. But the story of how they got their name, we will be telling in just a moment. So here is a table of data regarding the first two generations of Mcwhorters who were able to get their freedom in Kentucky. And here you see that the first person to get their freedom, Lucy, the second one on the list, in 1817, and that the decision for her to be the first one to be purchased out of slavery was that she was pregnant, and they wanted the next to be born free. And so you see, look down as you see Squire, he was born in 1817, the very year that Lucy was freed. He was born free, and the others were purchased. Now, another interesting aspect of this data is that you have gender-specific data. And one of the interesting things is that the women outlive the men. And not only that in general, but if you look at Judah, who was the oldest child, she wasn't freed until she was 50 years old. But of course, she lived longer than anybody else. She lived until 106. Now, use your historical imagination. What kind of questions would you ask to help understand the experience of each of these people in historical sequence? We don't have all the data, but it's our thinking about what might be the case, what is the most logical case that drives our research and helps us tell a story.
So this is the next generation of Solomon. Solomon was a later son of Frank and Lucy, and he became the family patriarch after Frank had passed away. And what's remarkable about him is that he was not freed until he was 20, but there is a letter, a document written by another descendant to describe the journey that Solomon and his father Frank took coming back from Kentucky after Frank went back to purchase his freedom in 1835. And the bottom note here from the descendant says, Solomon was not as outgoing as his father. He was a grown man when his father purchased his freedom. The years had weighed heavily on him. So you can see that he's a somber looking person, but you can also see, if you could read the fine print in this letter, that he was dedicated to his wife, Frances. So it says in the letter, I would like it if we could get married on Tuesday and get home on Thursday, if it would be according to your feelings. Tuesday is the 29th of this month, I believe. Any arrangement that da, 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 da. So he is making the final arrangements for their wedding. And she became, of course, the matriarch of the family, long outliving him, and they maintained the family for many, many years. The details of Solomon here tell you something about abolitionism and something about the McWhorter family. So on the left is a patent that he was awarded in 1867 for a particular kind of pan to help make sorghum syrup. Sorghum syrup was made from a grain that looks to an urbanite's eye, it doesn't look that different from wheat, but of course it is. And this was the fifth patent in the country awarded to a Black man and the first in the state of Illinois. So remarkable that he had this level of skill and level of connections to pull this off. But the other thing is sorghum was extremely important to the politics of the time. So as this woman who farmed adjacent to the McWhorters, Clarissa Shipman, wrote in letters to her offspring, your cousin Solomon is very busy making molasses from Chinese sugarcane, which he raises on 13 acres of his land. He makes about a barrel a day, which fetches $16. It is excellent if made good. So you see, we are getting quite independent of the South as to our sweetening. This was crucial because people who were against slavery were practicing a boycott of Southern goods to impact the Southern economy. And they used sorghum syrup instead of cane sugar or cane syrup. And so not only were the McWhorters in favor of abolitionism, so was Clarissa Shipman and her husband, in fact, who's on other documents going back to the very founding of New Philadelphia. And then in another letter, she talks about Lucy herself bearing her age remarkably well. I suppose she must be 100 years old, if not over. So the intimacy that Clarissa and the McWhorters, that the Shipmans and the McWhorters experienced, is expressed in her letters. And we were really privileged to be able to connect with a Shipman descendant, which is the woman in the red shirt below here, and peek into the letter collection of the Shipman family to help tell this story. And we were clued into it by people who had already begun to study New Philadelphia and the McWhorter. So all this is building on past work. So in this side, you see in the middle, you see Frances, but you see a reunion, like it says here, from about 1920. And the remarkable thing about this family, as was told in another family story by Gerald's uncle, Thelma, is that family was anybody that was born into the family and anybody that wanted to be in it. So there are several people in the back, for instance, number 9 here, the furthest left rear, the young man in the jacket. He was Hermes Zimmerman, and he was, for a time, lived with the McWhorters when his own family circumstances didn't allow him to stay with his family. And he has a story of his own in his own right that our volunteer executive director, Mary Nell, is researching and preparing to share, preparing to write up. But the other thing, the person I would point out here is the young little boy in the front on the right side, who with his head cocked to one side, is Gerald's father. So you see that these experiences of slavery are really not that far away. And when we have photographs and stories, photographs as wonderful as this one, where the people in them are numbered, and stories that go with them, then we can really understand that our nation's history in our own bones this way. And then another indication of the strength of this family, because a 40-year project of freeing 16 family members is one that is going to consolidate and knit the family together very, very closely. So the children that you saw in the front row in the last picture are pretty much portrayed here in these two pictures. First, a photo when they were still in New Philadelphia, and then a photo of them 50 years later as adults when they had migrated to Midwestern cities, Chicago especially, for jobs. And but the practice of family photos, the practice of gathering continues. And in fact, these were the last McWhorters who were born in New Philadelphia and raised there. So the centerpiece of the story that we're telling tonight is the New Philadelphia's 7 Ways to Freedom. And you're going to find these ways to freedom in other communities like Peoria, as we've already mentioned. So they worked their way, they ran to freedom, they bought each other out, they bought freedom for each other. They established a town, which was a beacon for freedom seekers. They helped other people run, especially through that town. They fought in the Civil War, and then finally they lived free. And if that is perhaps the supremest beacon of all, is the example of people who were living free. And we'll talk a bit more about that. So the first way we want to tell you about working, there were many different ways that people work to make money and to have the resources to get free and help others get free. But when Frank was still enslaved, he negotiated the ability to hire out. And this was done with his owner, but his owner got to keep some of the money, but Frank kept the rest of the money. This was while he was working during the day for the enslaver that owned him. But at night and whenever he could, he got a hold of the ability to work a saltpeter mine, to work a mine where he could extract a chemical that forms in these caves and turn it by boiling it into this white powder, which is an ingredient for gunpowder. And so this was a commodity that was in high demand in the early United States. People were hunting, people were fighting in wars, and this was part of how he made his money. And the last thing I would just say is that the owner with whom he negotiated this power to earn money outside of his working hours was also his father. So the determination, the ingenuity, the fortitude, the good fortune, all combined to really, so that Frank really earned his name, Free Frank.
Okay, the second way we want to discuss of the 7 ways to freedom is what has been called the Underground Railroad. Of course, it wasn't underground, but it was secret. And so underground does suggest that secrecy. But what's important is that we really want to use a different way to describe this. We want to describe the people as freedom seekers. In other words, it was a political act of stealing themselves from slavery to realize the promise of the founding documents of the United States, which had fine sounding words, but never applied to Black people. And so freedom seekers is very important. Now, the Frank Jr. in Kentucky, first son of Frank and Lucy, became a freedom seeker and left Kentucky and found his way to Canada. And we know this because, as you see on the left, we have correspondence addressed to him in Canada. So we can identify the county of Essex. And on the right, you see a church, which dates back to that time when the freedom seekers community in Canada built that church. And so we're thinking, again, remember the historical imagination point, we're thinking that he was in that town, and that church is a very important place for us. And it's a town and a church that can connect us to other freedom seekers. And so there's a whole series of research questions. Now, if you go to the left and you look at the red lines, what we think is important is that there are no set trails or paths for freedom seekers. that people used every possible route they could, and mainly along the way would be looking for other African Americans to help them. Otherwise, they would be taking quite a risk until they were guided to someone who was safe. The third way of freedom that's already been mentioned is that the McWhorters, based on Free Frank's entrepreneurial skill, was able to acquire enough money, both in Kentucky as well as in Illinois, to save enough money to go back to buy 16 family members out of slavery. So we're talking about 3 generations being freed between 1817 and 1850s. Now, it's also important to point out that the McWhorters were not the only family doing this. For example, there's a Walker family. They came through Missouri and were able to buy their freedom and resettle in New Philadelphia and Hadley Township. And it was interesting because the tendency was for Walker women to marry McWhorter men. So my grandmother was Ophelia Walker. And so, but here again, there's a gender bias in genealogical research, because often we follow the last name to suggest family history. But the fact of the matter is that in the US context, the last name is associated with the men. And so we have yet to do the full research we want to do on the women who married into the McWhorter male name. Now, the fourth way, and this is a very important aspect of the McWhorter experience, because if you remember what Kate said about the petition, they were talking about the inability of African Americans in general to participate as legal activists, as legal citizens of the state of Illinois. But here, in this way to freedom, we find that New Philadelphia and the McWhorters set new precedents. First, of course, the platting of the town in 1836 involved Frank networking with other people, Euro-Americans in the town, to help legitimate the process. But also, the very next year, in 1837, Frank was able to get the state legislature, which then was based in Vandalia, to pass what we call the Mcwater Law. Now listen carefully to what the Mcwater Law says. It is enacted by the people of the state of Illinois, represented in the General Assembly, that the name of Free Frank of the County of Pike and state of Illinois be and is hereby changed to that of Frank McWorter, by which latter name he shall hereafter be called and known, and sue and be sued, plead and be impleaded, purchase and convey both real and personal property in said last mentioned name. And the children of said Free Frank shall hereafter take the name of their father as changed and provided for by this act. This is a precedent that speaks directly to the demand that was coming out of the 1853 Colored Convention. This is the importance of the initiative that Frank took. Another interesting and important point is that Abe Lincoln was in Vandalia for this vote. And so there is a connection between Lincoln and McWhorters. Now, it wasn't just that Frank Jr. became a freedom seeker and went to Canada. Another way that the New Philadelphia experience represented freedom was the fact that New Philadelphia became a station, a connecting point on the so-called Underground Railroad, where freedom seekers were welcome. And one of the interesting things, and again, I go back to the historical basis on which we make this argument, our family history, our oral history that was passed down generation to generation was a story of the way in which New Philadelphia assisted on the Underground Railroad. We grew up knowing the story that if you could get to New Philadelphia, you could get a pair of shoes, you could get a horse, and those McWorter boys would help you get on to Canada. And one of the interesting things is that it was after the archaeologists began to excavate and discuss what their findings were that we began to get historical evidence, documents, that there were in fact two cobblers in New Philadelphia. And of course, using historical imagination, we know people were asking the question, how come you need that many shoes? And so these stories begin to aggregate, and we be able to understand this experience of the freedom struggle.
The point that we want to make here with this slide is that all kinds of people in New Philadelphia are part of this mission. And this couple here, the Eckleburgers, their story comes down to us through their descendants who are drawn, or who are circled here in red, and through the little girl who grew up to give an oral history to one of the archaeology students who was participating in the digs that happened in New Philadelphia 10 or so years ago. So the story that was handed down through her family is that when the slave catchers would come by the Eckleburgers farm, the Mrs. Eckleburger there at top right, shown there as a young woman, would throw a chicken out into the yard after she'd wrung its neck, and the dog would start barking. There'd be a lot of commotion, and everybody would say, oh, they just killed a chicken, and they would keep moving. Not only that, but she told a story of how her I think it was her grandparents had a double-bottomed wagon, as you see in this picture, where people could be hidden in the bottom part of the wagon, and the top part would be loaded with produce, and it would look like it was just a wagon full of produce that was moving on. This particular wagon is not from New Philadelphia, but is remarkable because it's from South Carolina. So this practice of double-bottomed wagons was used all the way into the South to help transport freedom seekers. And it's really a precious material reminder of what happened. And so we're really honored to be able to share that photo from South Carolina with you all. And again, the little boy circled in green there is Gerald's father. And this is a picture from New Philadelphia School. The other interesting thing about the documents is that just 2 years after Frank and Lucy and Frank Jr. and their 3 youngest children arrived in New Philadelphia, just 2 years after that, the church they belonged to, which was Berry Baptist Church, sent Frank to be one of 3 representatives to a convention of churches that was held just down the road a bit. Churches that were attempting to form an association that was distinct from the association in Missouri that was overseeing these early churches. So one of the things we may never know is what else was discussed at that meeting, because anytime people were able to gather, there might be an unofficial meeting to discuss signals, to discuss successes, to discuss ways to improve on the Underground Railroad in that area. And we were really gratified the very first time we went to New Philadelphia, you as an adult at least, was to meet the secretary of Berry Baptist Church who showed us these minutes, and that's why we were able to show them to you. The next way that we want to describe that the New Philadelphians fought for freedom was literally they fought in the Civil War. And this here just emphasizes the African-American young men who signed up to fight in the Civil War, because they had to go elsewhere to fight because the army was segregated at that point. They couldn't sign up with the white Pike Countyans that they had grown up with. The picture of the button, the Union Army button, is a button that came out of New Philadelphia, and then the star on the spike here was a marker that was placed on the graves of veterans of the Civil War after the war by the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the veterans organization, which was continued to be militantly anti-slavery and pro-freedom. So here, the records that we're showing you are from, I believe these are from Ancestry.com, which has extracted the materials from the National Archives. And then finally, as we were alluding to earlier, New Philadelphians lived free on land that they owned with guns just 20 miles from slavery. And this is a remarkable achievement in a time where the Civil War, right before it broke out as a military war, and even during the military 4 years of the military war, it was fought in every community of the United States, because there were people on both sides of the issue, and on both sides of the economy, the slave economy and the northern economy, really in every county and every state. So we really want to express this in three ways. One, with this group photograph, which is findable in various descendant families' collection, which suggests strongly that it comes from New Philadelphia. And the local farmer there said, oh, definitely, those are peach trees, and everybody around here used to grow peaches. And meanwhile, the descendants who moved to Canada said, well, that helps us understand it, because we knew
Kansas,
this wasn't,
yeah.
Sorry, Kansas. We knew this wasn't Kansas, because you can't grow a peach. You couldn't grow a peach in Kansas back then. So there's an actual picture that appears to be from New Philadelphia. And then on the right here, this is a relatively famous piece of art by Charles White, who was a 20th century artist, but it really conveys the groundedness, the calm, the resolve, and the strength of two brothers who were farmers. And so we really want to include that there to express all the different ways that history is told, one of them being through art. And then at the bottom there, those are 3 cabins that same local farmer who thought about the peaches obtained by hook and by crook, by donation, by putting out the word, and installed on existing foundations in New Philadelphia to really recreate the landscape, to help people envision what it was like in those early days, where that blacksmith was, for instance, because along with the cobblers, there was a blacksmith who was making shoes for horses.
Of course, the New Philadelphia story has always been told, has always been known through the generations that lived and grew in New Philadelphia down till today. But the story hasn't always been acknowledged as part of the official history of the country. This, of course, is part of the battle of ideas. What gets into the official history and what doesn't? Well, we now live in new times. And so for the last decades, New Philadelphia has become part of the story of the country. As you can see on the left, there's this 2005 acknowledgement setting forth New Philadelphia as part of the National Register of Historic Places. In the top right, you see that brown sign where the state legislature named a section of the highway the Free Frank McWorter Historic Memorial Highway. The more recent and wonderful development we're so very proud to announce is that Congressman LaHood of Illinois has put forward the legislative proposal, HR 820, the New Philadelphia National Historic Park Act, which follows a statement signed by late President Barack Obama for the National Park Service to do a study. Well, on the basis of that, the LaHood legislation has just passed the committee in the House to send it to the full House of Representatives to be passed. And Senator Durbin is also putting forward a version of this act through the Senate. So we're very optimistic that the New Philadelphia land will become part of the National Park Service as a national park, a National Historic Park. And that's so very, very exciting for us. And back really to the question of what is history, and history is telling a story. Here we have five of the books that are telling the story. Of course, the sixth is the book that Kate and I have written. But beginning in 1964 with the Pike County Historical Society, based on interviews with Thelma, who grew up there, and the 1981 volume is a volume by, again, a McWorter, Helen McWorter Simpson, who was basically based in Cleveland. She's the one who wrote down the oral history of Frank's journey to go back to buy his son Solomon and what their conversation was. In 1983, my first cousin, Thelma's daughter, this is really her book, which is based on her dissertation in history at the University of Chicago under John Hope Franklin, telling the story of Free Frank. And then the book, 2011, and the journal, special journal, archaeology journal dealing with New Philadelphia in 2010, really those two volumes are really telling the story based on the archaeological research, as well as the oral history that helps to tie together the data that was gathered in the archaeology work.
The last piece of news that we want to share is that a Looking for Lincoln sign is just about placed in that spot where you see that big hole dug in Barry, Illinois. And we are really, really pleased about this, because as we've been thinking and as we've been talking about our book, we're beginning to see that the current stage is really for us to connect all these different stories to really have an accurate picture of the whole state, that these are not isolated events. They're connected, and they're connected. And the two ways that the two sides of this sign are explaining that is, first of all, connecting to Lincoln, because he was in Vandalia when the McWhorter Law was passed, and his good friend from Pike County, Colonel Ross, was the one who put the bill forward. And then the other side of the sign connects the McWhorters to Barry, Illinois, which is the modern existing town nearest to New Philadelphia. And that, of course, is the story of the Barry Baptist Church, which we were telling before. So we really are seeing that we and other people who study different cases of African Americans, of abolitionism in Illinois, are beginning to now find connections between ourselves. And we're really pleased that the New Philadelphia Association has been able to work with the Looking for Lincoln group to erect a sign. And again, just like the National Park Service, draw more attention to the story of New Philadelphia and its connections. Now, we haven't emphasized it a lot, but these two slides that we want to show before we get to questions, no, I'm sorry, just before we get to conclusions, really express all the people that have been involved in telling this story and getting it into the media, getting it into TV show, getting it into articles, into curricula, into museums like the Peoria Riverfront Museum. And it's a mix. It is local historians and local farmers. It is local history tellers like Janita, the woman at the top who showed us the minutes book from Barry Baptist Church. It's descendants like you see sitting, linking arms there. It's local newspapers like the Pike County Express. And then in the centerpiece really is the archaeologists. The New Philadelphia Association was able to mount a sustained campaign and recruit archaeologists to come and dig in the land that was New Philadelphia. And they proceeded to find an astonishing number of 150,000 artifacts, plant remains, and animal remains, from which they were able to develop new findings and new conclusions and new questions about what was the life like for people who lived there. Could you see regionalisms? Could you see retention of Africanisms and that sort of thing? So there's much more than we can tell you in this one evening, but like Gerald was showing you, there's places you can go and find out more about that. And this second slide just expresses more of the collaboration and more of the treasured artifacts that have been a part of this story. And the last woman we would tell you about here was Sarah, was Frank's daughter, and that's her sitting in for her portrait. And she went back, and in one day in 1854, just at the time that her father had died, she purchased 3 children from 3 different owners in that part of Kentucky. All of this without being able to read and having to make her way through the extremely dangerous landscape of the 1850s, dangerous for Black people to move through. So the sustained and ingenious efforts of people that are alive today and people that are no longer with us is really why the story has stuck with us for all these years.
So now, as we conclude our talk, we want to now step back a little from the details that we've been discussing and ask certain basic questions and make certain basic statements. So what can we learn from New Philadelphia? First, that remember history is our greatest teacher. And that as a part of that, it's not history of other people. Knowledge of self is essential. And also, it's not also history as a secret. Knowledge is often hidden in plain view. But that the fact of the matter is, rather than thinking about history as famous people, we can flip that script and start talking about examining particular cases like Pike County, Illinois. And through that case, connecting it to Springfield, to Alton, to Carlinville, to Peoria, gets us to the universal knowledge that we need. So let's talk about New Philadelphia and today. Frank and Lucy's town grew into a community that prospered and held together by the American tradition of neighborliness. So let's ask the question to ourselves, can we practice this tradition and be good neighbors to each other? People used to take care of each other and strangers were always welcome. They were the source of news and the source of entertainment. Today, can we welcome strangers? Can we change the unwelcomeness that often dominates? And they talk about freedom. In New Philadelphia, Americans from Africa and Europe lived together in this abolitionist village guided by a freedom mission. And not only did they live together, they helped people escape from slavery. And then they sent their sons, Black and white, to fight in the Civil War. In other words, they stood for freedom. So today in this country, terrorism threatens us, and the FBI tells us the most dangerous terrorism is internal to this country based on white supremacy. The legacy of slavery lives in white power and fascist militia movements. So now is the time for every freedom-loving person to take a stand and build on the legacy of New Philadelphia. Basically, we sum it up this way. If New Philadelphia was possible, then maybe the future of this country is possible. And that's why we think it's so very important for us to continue telling this story and for you to think about it, but not just about New Philadelphia, think about your own town and what stories you can find there, which demonstrate that this can be a country of freedom, because that's the story that needs to be told. We so very much appreciate the opportunity to have made this presentation, and we welcome any questions or discussion.
Thank you so much, Gerald and Kate. That was a really wonderful presentation. I so appreciate you including some history about Peoria in there as well and making some of those connections. So we do have a couple questions for you this evening. Before I get into that, I just want to say that it has been a great honor for me to learn more about New Philadelphia. I was actually first exposed to the history of New Philadelphia as a graduate student. I was doing some research for my graduate degree. I was doing some research at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum and Library, working through the Lincoln Home all in Springfield. And I first learned about Frank McWorter then, and that history stuck with me for many, many years. And so it was an honor for me to be able to do this exhibition and dig a little deeper and do my part in telling this wonderful story. So we'll go ahead and get into a couple questions here. So the first one I would like to ask is, Gerald, did you grow up knowing the story of New Philadelphia and your descendant, Frank McWorter, or was there a certain point in your life or a descendant that told you that, or how did you come to be the teller of this wonderful history?
It's an interesting, this has been with us. This is part of our DNA. The family tradition was really told by my aunt, Thelma, who's been mentioned. She had gone to Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. And in one of her classes, it was said that African Americans didn't know their history. And she said, well, we do. And then went back to Pike County and gathered up all kinds of historical documents and brought them back. And that's why we have such a treasure trove of historical documents. And part of the story is that the McWorter name usually has an H in it. And our oral history in the family was that Frank, when he got his name, that 1837 act passed, took the H out. And so if ever you see somebody with the McWorter name without the H, then you figure they're relatives some kind of way. So we grew up knowing this story because Thelma would always tell the story. She was an elementary school teacher, and she used to make these poster boards and cut out newspaper articles. And she was very much involved in Black history, the Association for the Study of Afro-American Life and History. And she was also a founding member of the DuSable Museum in Chicago, working with Margaret Burroughs. So we grew up with this story. In fact, it was a story that my relatives told. And I'm growing up, I just said, I've heard that story too many times. But then suddenly we had a family reunion, and because I was the acorn that rolled away from the tree. I mean, I was an activist in the 60s, and I like most kids, I wasn't interested in what my older relatives were telling me. Anyway, we had a family reunion, and suddenly the family elected me as a spokesperson. So I'm back. And I'm glad I'm back, because suddenly now this is a national story. And it's a story that I had to figure out. It's not just about us, the McWhorters. It's about all those people who came through New Philadelphia as freedom seekers. It's about all the people in New Philadelphia who assisted the freedom seekers. It's our story. And that's why it's such a wonderful opportunity to tell it. And so anyway, I thank you for the question.
Yeah, no, that was so interesting. I feel like so often we later in life learn about our family history by certain happenstance, or someone makes an offhanded comment and your ears kind of perk up to it. So it's very wonderful that your family was sharing this story for your entire life, and you made your way back to it.
Well, let me just add one little piece. When we were kids, we were taken to New Philadelphia. So I visited as a child. And we actually have and I grew up hearing the names of the neighbors. The Glecklers, the Johnsons, these were names my father would tell stories. And what's interesting is that there's a picture we have of me as, I don't know, 6 years old or something, standing in front of a horse. So I meet this guy, his name is Harry Wright, who unfortunately is now passed, but he was on the board of the New Philadelphia Association. And when we showed him the picture, he said, I know that horse. I know the name of that horse, and he called the name. So, it's like, what is history? It's living, it's here with us. And so it's wonderful to meet people who knew my father as children. It's fabulous. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we have a couple more questions here. Let me see. So this one is a little bit more specific to uh, New Philadelphia. So was there a post office in New Philadelphia? And in addition to that, I would also be curious to learn a little bit more about the businesses in New Philadelphia and what that meant to the community.
Mm, mm. Yeah, absolutely. There was a post office. That's part of what it made it a town, right? And towns in Illinois had to form and had to have a unique name in order to get a post office. The post office lasted until 1885, and then it lost its post office because residents were migrating elsewhere in order to get jobs because farming had become technological, and so all the work that used to go into a farm, they needed fewer people to farm, and so those people had to find a way to earn a living. Um, so during that 1836, 1885 period, there were innumerable businesses. The two cobblers, a general store. There's a whole list of them that are in our book, and I don't think we're going to be able to run down the whole list tonight. But it was a commercial center, as small as it was, which was 200 or fewer people. It was a commercial hub for all the farmers in that immediate area, and there were a lot of small towns like New Philadelphia. The Middle West, and for that matter, the whole country was populated with a lot of very small towns. They didn't have the landscape of big cities and then absolutely almost empty countryside the way we're used to seeing Illinois now, with big agribusiness farms. It was much, people were more evenly distributed across the landscape. The life in New Philadelphia featured not only a lot of long-time stable family members. So the Burdick family and the Burdicks were a part of signing the plat, helping to certify the plat map that we showed you when New Philadelphia was first established. Well, they were also the last to farm in the absolute town area of New Philadelphia. So that was from 1836 to 1980. And what the remaining farmhouse in the town, which is a bit hidden from the trees, is called the Burdick House in their honor. And Burdicks still live in Pike County. So the town can be described by enumerating the stores in it, or by saying was there a post office or not, or whatnot. But it also can be described by the power of the memory of people who are descended from that town. So it was that last farmer who also drew some of the maps that helped the archaeologists know where to dig. And it was also that farmer who conspired with the other farmers to put a stone to mark the town when it was more and more thinned out and more the buildings had been removed to do farming. And the New Philadelphia Association has the letter that he wrote to discuss, here's where you should put the stone, we've talked about it, and this is why we want you to put it there. So so that's a really good question, but there's a lot of ways to measure the existence of a town.
Yeah, so on that, if you could maybe just expand a little bit more, because I think the creation of a town or a community isn't something we really think about too much nowadays. Towns and cities have long been established. So what went into formally, I should say, creating the community of New Philadelphia? So you mentioned the post office was a requirement. Were there any other requirements?
Yeah, well, the plat was a requirement because you had to delineate the lots that people could live on and could buy. You had to turn farmland into town lots. So you did that, first of all, by surveying them out. And what's interesting is 20th century surveys bore out the accuracy of that survey, which was done in 1836 with different kinds of tools than we're used to. But then you had to sell those lots to get people to move there. Mm-hmm. And that was a big part of the growth of all these teeny tiny towns that started emerging then, right? Chicago was smaller than New Philadelphia when New Philadelphia was founded. Was that people got a hold of the land, right? The land of Pike County was primarily allocated to veterans of the War of 1812. And those veterans then turned around and either settled there or sold the land and used that money as a way to live wherever they wanted to live. So that the land that was first allocated by the government as a sort of a pension or a bounty paid to veterans was sold either directly to Frank or to someone else who then Frank purchased it from. And then Frank began the process of promoting the town to live there. And so that the picture we showed you of it said New Philadelphia on top with the plat, that was the promotional flyer that he used. And you can imagine that the abolitionist movement rallied, and Black people moving west rallied. This is where we want to move. They could choose Chicago, Peoria, New Philadelphia, and they moved to New Philadelphia.
Let me just mention two other things. One is that a town is like a center point for the surrounding area. And one of the things that made New Philadelphia a key part with that post office is that it was on a road that the stagecoach would deliver the mail and so on. So it was a place where people passed through. So that was a point on that. And the second point is that there was a church that became a community center. And so again, it was for education, for religious services, and again, it drew in people because literally Frank didn't live in the actual town limits of New Philadelphia. He lived across the street in a farmhouse that he built, and then subsequently several other generations lived there. That's the house my father grew up in. So it's a we say after 1885, New Philadelphia continued to exist as a settlement. In other words, people lived there. In fact, people lived there until the 1950s.
80s.
So, yeah, but it's an interesting question. Again, you know, when we think of a town, we have to use our historical memory and imagination to figure out what it was like back then.
Right.
You know, not what it's like now.
Yeah. Okay, let's see here. We have another question. Would you explain the use of the word agency regarding people?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yes. Particularly with regard to African Americans. Often, what racism does is it liquidates the humanity of people. And this liquidation of humanity involves really, it says that, well, they are different, their brains are different, their motivation is different. And so it defines people as dependent on others. And so the story of the anti-slavery movement is often what European Americans did for Black people. In other words, they needed help to get free. And the concept agency says, wait a minute, the physiologists tell us that all human beings have a brain, have different parts of their brain. And so reason and emotion are capacities that we all share. And the second thing is that all life forms, be it plant or animal, try to live. You know, if you try to keep a plant away from sun, you know, it'll find a way to get some sun. And so you have to then figure, well, Black people, I mean, who were slaves had to be thinking about how to get free. And so that thought, that hypothetical, leads one then to say, what was the agency of African Americans? In other words, what did they do in their own self-interest to get free? And what's interesting about that, historically, is that when Black people have acted in their own interest to get free, it stimulates a national movement for freedom. So if you think about the 1960s, what Black people were doing to get free impacted women, impacted Latinos, impacted a new stage of the workers' movement. In other words, it becomes an American story. So that this struggle for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all men are created equal. These are wonderful words that have never really been totally true. But it's the journey, and it's the journey of African Americans who fought in their own interest that we're really important to tell. Lincoln and Mark Twain, right in the middle of that is the agency of African Americans. And we think that's an important aspect to the retelling of American history.
Wow, yeah, that was a great question and a really compelling answer. So thank you so much for that. So we have, let's see, we have time, I think, for just one final question here. Okay, yeah. Could you talk just a little bit on the experience? So after Frank purchases Lucy and they begin their freedom journey, what was that like for them immediately after? So their initial journey to Illinois, what was that experience like for them? Because that has, I imagine, thinking about that question, that has to be kind of a harrowing time to purchase your own freedom and then make your way by yourself north.
Yeah. Well, the general idea is that at a certain point they said, we got to get out of here, because the conditions of as slavery became much more of a grand scale operation in the United States, really taking over huge swaths of the economy, then free Black people were more and more endangered, especially in the territory of Kentucky and other slave states where slavery predominated to such an extent. So there was a decision they had to get out of there. And but so 1817 they purchased Lucy. 1819 Frank. They have three free children, and they have those additional children that are still enslaved. It wasn't until 1829 that they were able to make contact with Frank in Canada. And we don't know how Frank Jr., what prompted him to go to Canada. We just know that he went there from the letter and from other details in family history, to say, look, we have the money, we need you to come back, because we know that we need to have legal freedom papers for you, because we need one of our adult children to help us get to Illinois, because it was right around that same time of Frank coming back from Canada, getting his freedom papers, selling all that Frank could sell, including that saltpeter operation, buying the land in Illinois sight unseen. So that 1829, 1830, 1831 period was very intense. A lot of things came to fruition that had been percolating in their minds, and they had been preparing for the 10 years before that. So they leave in 1830 from Kentucky to make their way to Illinois and run into the great snow of Illinois and of the Midwest generally of 1830, which kept them from getting to their land until things thawed out in the spring of 31. So it was a prolonged 6-month trip from Kentucky to that land in Illinois. Incidentally, it was the same time that Lincoln was landing in Illinois. So the first decade, we really know the most about that from general history, because we don't know the family history specifics except for these markers of when they were able to purchase freedom. When Frank came back from Canada, we have dots that we use the national narrative to connect those dots, to make a logical story out of it. But if you think about the fact that the last 3 of the 16 were purchased in 1854, that's 23 more years that they were in Illinois, saving and communicating and this sort of thing. And another interesting dot is that a letter came from one of the enslavers' family members,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
To the family in Illinois, saying, come now, it's time for you to buy because so-and-so is moving and so-and-so is died and
they're
so-and-so.
going to sell them down the river.
Exactly. So that prompted that last journey or two to grab up the people that they could. And another interesting dot is the fact that one of the free offspring, one of the free grandchildren of Frank that grew up in Illinois, she was born to the free children. She was named after someone who was enslaved, Lucy Ann, and that just conveyed the closeness that this family was able to sustain even across this distance, which was way longer than Kentucky to Illinois today.
Well, that's another manifestation of agency. In other words, affirming family ties through a naming process over a long period of time. In other words, people didn't forget each other. They affirmed each other.
Yeah, that's so true. Wow, I feel like I could listen and I could probably ask my own questions all night, but we have reached our limit for this evening's presentation, but I just want to thank both of you so much for doing this program. I hope we have an opportunity in the future to talk more and be able to serve our guests this wonderful information. So again, tonight's program will be available on the museum's YouTube page. And thank you to all the audience members who joined us and asked questions for this evening's program. Just a quick reminder, if you haven't had a chance to see the museum's exhibition, Community, African American Freedom, Perseverance and Leadership During Migration, it is open. We will be hosting a special dedication on August 26th. We'll be sharing more information on our website and about that in general very soon. And as always, thank you to our presenters, museum members, Visionary Society for putting this together. And thank you to the New Philadelphia Association. They are doing some wonderful work down there. I encourage everyone to look up the organization, follow them on Facebook. They're doing some great stuff, and I look forward to hearing about how the historical National Park Service designation goes. So.
Well, one thing we also want to say is if there were other questions that there weren't time for tonight, go to our website. Our email is right there, or go to Facebook. We love to talk to people about this.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's a great point as well. Reach out to any of us. We will get you the answers. We'll reach out to Gerald and Kate and New Philadelphia Association. So again, thank you so much to everyone joining this evening, and we will see you all soon. Thank you.
Yeah.